Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the season premiere of our e-lecture series on uh, the Gaza war. We have the pleasure of having with us Professor Gause tonight. He's going to talk to us about the new Middle East Cold War goes hot. That's the title of the lecture. Uh, Zakia,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, yes, we have the foremost expert on IR in the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf and the American foreign policy towards the region. F. Gregory Gause is a professor of international affairs and John H. Lindsey 44 chair at the Bush School of Government and Public Service, Texas A&M University. He's also a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's an honor to have you here today, sir. The floor is yours.
Thanks very
Before,
much.
I'm so sorry. Before we get started, Professor Russo's just arrived,
Yeah, okay.
so I'm really sorry. I'm admitting him. Here, he should be able to join us now.
Hello, Professor Gause.
Professor
Good
Russo,
evening from Greece.
thank you.
So,
Uh,
Mr. Russos, we've done the introductions. Um,
Right.
this is
And
yeah,
I want to say before starting that when my colleagues here told me that you have accepted our invitation, I was so glad. I mean, I don't know I don't know you personally, but I kept on reading your work for years now. So it
Thank
is. I'm very pleased that you accepted our invitation, and we are very honored with this.
thank you very much. My pleasure.
We can start
yeah.
we can start the meeting if we can.
Yeah.
Like yeah.
Yes, it's already in place. Everything is in place. Let's just give the floor to Professor
Yes.
Gauss. The floor is yours,
Right.
sir.
I mean, I'm with you.
Yeah, it's recording.
Great.
One
Okay.
minute.
Okay. Well, thank
Uh,
you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you, even if only virtually, to talk about this not so pleasant topic, the Gaza war. And my framing here is I see the Gaza war as part of a much larger regional crisis that has been going on for almost a quarter of a century now, since the turn of the millennium. I think, and I characterize this in past writings as the new Middle East Cold War. And let me tell you why I think that Gaza is basically a reflection of this larger regional crisis. When I talk about the new Middle East Cold War, I'm referring back to uh, an extremely important book about the international relations of the Middle East region, written by Malcolm Kerr back in 1970, called "The Arab Cold War," and it was an account of the conflictual relations among the Arab states during the Arab nationalist period when Gamal Abdel Nasser was president of Egypt and was really the leader of the Arab nationalist movement. And the key, I think, to understanding that period was that it was relatively easy for Nasser to insert himself into the domestic politics of numerous Arab states: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. And not just militarily. The only place where Egypt was able to insert itself militarily was Yemen, and that wasn't very successful during the Yemeni civil war of the 1960s. Uh, But what Nasser could do from basically the mid-50s and the fight over the Baghdad Pact was to mobilize support for his political positions in the domestic politics of a Lebanon or a Jordan or a Syria or an Iraq in a way that pressured the existing leaders. And so it was the new Arab Cold War was really about the ability of other states to insert themselves in the domestic politics of their neighbors. And of course, that requires your targets to be relatively weak states. And I don't mean weak in terms of the size of their militaries, right? The classic international relations notion of a weak state is, of course, a state that it doesn't have a very powerful military, can't defend itself, right? I'm talking about weak institutionally within the domestic politics of the state. That is to say, a state that can't really control its borders, that is not able through a combination of unforced loyalty and forced surveillance and repression to basically prevent outsiders from intervening in its politics and in political mobilization of its citizens. I use the example of Kuwait, I think, to illustrate this difference. On the one hand, in the classical definition, contemporary Kuwait is a very weak state. It doesn't have a large army. We know in 1990, the Iraqi army was able to occupy the country in 12 hours. But in terms of its institutional structures and its control over its own domestic polity and society, Kuwait's a very strong state, right? It's been able to vest the loyalty of the vast majority of its citizens in the state itself. It's been able to build institutions, both for the distribution of oil revenues and for the control of society and economy, that has made Kuwait a relatively stable, relatively well-run place. So what's happened in the last 25 years, I would argue, in the Arab world, and to some extent in the broader Middle East, but I'm going to concentrate on the Arab world. What's happened is we've seen the collapse of authority and governance in many, many of the states of the Arab world, right? When people look at the Middle East, they frequently divide it up between Arabs and Israelis, Arabs and non-Arabs, Sunnis and Shia. I actually think that the most important division in the Middle East, the most important distinction, is between states that are relatively efficiently run and states where central authority has either weakened or collapsed. And I think that what we've seen in the last 25 years in the Arab world is this weakening or collapse of authority in a number of important states. I'll discuss this in more detail later in the lecture, but think about it, right? Right now, you have a Libya that is basically ungoverned from the central authority. There is no competent central authority in Libya. The Palestinian Authority, of course, divided between Gaza and the West Bank, between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Lebanon, which can't even elect a president and has a hard time even picking up the garbage, where a non-state actor like Hezbollah can basically run its own foreign policy in Lebanon. A civil war in Syria, which is to some extent coming to a close, but has divided that country for almost 15 years. An Iraq that is still trying to rebuild from the American invasion of 2003. And a Yemen where, again, a non-state actor, the Houthis, has basically been able to chart its own independent foreign policy and to control the capital of the country. So we've seen the collapse of authority in so many places in the Arab world. And the ironic thing about this, is, as it characterizes the politics of the region, is it came on the heels of 3 decades, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where politics in the Arab world was remarkably stable in terms of domestic regime security, right? The Arab world had a reputation from the 40s and 50s and 60s as being a very unstable place, frequent changes of government, military coups, and the like. But once you hit 1970, you had an enormous stability, right? Muammar Gaddafi ruling Libya from 1969 until 2011. Hafez al-Assad comes to power in 1970, and his son is still the president of Syria. The Hashemite, all of the monarchies that survived that period of the first decades of independence, where many monarchies fell, but all the monarchies that existed in 1970 exist today. There hasn't been a single monarchical overthrow, right, since the Libyan monarchy was overthrown in 1969. The Ba'athist regime came to power in Iraq in 1968 and was only dislodged in 2003 by the American invasion. It was a very stable political environment in terms of regimes. All right. Why was this so? I think it can be attributable to a considerable extent to the oil revolution of the 1970s. Right? Oil states, exporters of oil, and many of the states, the Arab states of the Persian Gulf and Libya, were major oil exporters. They were able to use oil wealth to build the infrastructures of power, to build the institutions of power, distributive institutions and repressive institutions. And even for the non-oil states, for an Egypt or a Syria, the oil wealth that came floating into the region after 1970 also helped these states as well, sometimes directly as the oil countries gave them foreign aid. To some extent, it took economic pressure off these non-oil states. So many of their citizens went to work in the oil states, thus providing another source of hard currency as they would send money back to their families back home. Right? Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and Jordanians working in the Gulf states, hundreds of thousands of Egyptians working in Saudi Arabia, working in Libya. There was this significant population movement within the Arab world as a result of the oil revolution that I think helped to strengthen the state. So for maybe you buy that, maybe there's other reasons. The 70s, 80s, and 90s were a remarkably stable period in the domestic politics of most Arab states. But that changes when we hit the 2000s. So let me just run through the events that led to this new geopolitical reality of collapsed and weakened authority. So let's start with Lebanon. Lebanon was always a weak state. It had never been able to overcome the sectarian divisions on which Lebanese politics were based. And any effort to try to strengthen the central authority in Lebanon always ran afoul of the leaders of the various sectarian communities who were the arbiters of power in Lebanese politics. And so when Lebanon collapses, it collapses in 1975 into a civil war in which Syrian troops intervene, the Israelis invade in 1982, the authority of the Lebanese central government really no longer exists during the civil war. The Iranian revolutionary regime establishes its first client in Hezbollah in the early 1980s, in the wake of the Israeli invasion of 1982. And Lebanon remains a playing field for outside powers, the Syrians most notably right up until 2005, but also the Iranians, the Saudis, the Israelis, to sponsor local allies, local clients, local proxies. So Lebanon kind of was the model for the weak Arab state, the Arab state that was open to outside influences, that was in which the central government could not wall off and prevent these interventions, either directly or indirectly, and in which local regional powers fought out their rivalries. Whether it was the Israelis and the Syrians, and later the Iranians and the Israelis, Lebanon was a playing field. But I would argue in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that was the exception in the Arab world. Right? You had relatively strong regimes, very repressive. Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, Hafez al-Assad's regime in Syria, very repressive regimes, but regimes that were able to control their society, control their borders, control their economy, and become players rather than playing fields in regional politics. So the 2000s basically began with the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. This was, the Iraqi state had been weakened by its defeat in war in 1990-91 by a punishing regime of international sanctions. But despite that fact, the regime was able to hold on to power. And for reasons that don't need to detain us, but have a lot to do with the 9/11 attacks on the United States and the atmosphere that created within the United States. In 2003, the United States invades Iraq, full of hubris. That's a Greek word, by the way, hubris, right? What I understand. Full of hubris and believing that as the world's only superpower, as the country that had won the world's only superpower, there was a strong belief that the United States could destroy the Iraqi state and rebuild it from the ground up in an image that the United States would not only approve of, but could serve as a model for the rest of the region. So the United States, as a matter of policy, very deliberately destroyed what were the three main pillars of the modern authoritarian state in the global South, right? The ruling party, the Ba'athist Party, was declared illegal, right? The army was disbanded, and the bureaucracy was gutted. In a policy that basically said that no one who had served in a high position in the Iraqi government bureaucracy during the Ba'athist period would be allowed to resume government work. And that, of course, meant that everybody who had any idea about how to do anything was kept out of the Iraqi government. Because, I mean, Iraq, the Ba'athist regime, much like the Soviet regime, you had to be a party member to get to any level of responsibility and competence in any government ministry. And so the United States, as a matter of policy, basically destroyed the Iraqi government and believed it could rebuild it as a democracy, as a country friendly with the United States, as a country that would sign a peace treaty with Israel, as a country that would join the American regional alliance system. And in that sense, the United States effort in Iraq was an utter failure. The Iraqi state became kind of an open playing field for the intervention of a number of regional powers, the most successful of which was Iran, which was able to establish all sorts of proxy groups within Iraq and support them to the extent that Iran basically had a veto over the formation of Iraqi governments and over major Iraqi government policy. Iraq is still struggling to try to reconstruct some kind of efficient centralized government. and it faces the obvious problem that all sorts of the Iranians continue to support proxies. The Kurdish groups in the north of Iraq have basically set up a de facto independent state there, and the government is riddled with corruption and is open to outside influence. So Iraq becomes a playing field. What had been a major player in the region, a country that had started two major regional wars, the Iran-Iraq War and then the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, becomes not a player but a playing field in which other regional and international players play out their own rivalries, particularly in Iraq, the American-Iranian rivalry. So all of a sudden, in the heart of the Arab East, a major player in regional politics is broken open. Then comes the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings of 2010 and 2011. And this breaks a number of other states, breaks them open. We know that there was regime change in Egypt and Tunisia. Both those places had built relatively efficient and effective state institutions. Not always the most flexible and certainly not always the most adapted to the modern economy. But in terms of control and surveillance, state institutions that were able to control society, control borders, and prevent outside interventions. And despite the regime changes that we saw in Egypt and Tunisia, in essence, the old guard, the old state elites never went away and have, I would argue, recaptured power in Tunisia and Egypt. But in the other places where there were regime-shaking crises during the Arab uprisings of 2011, we have seen the cracking open of those states. Libya, most obviously, still undergoing a civil war in which non-state actors and outside powers, be it Russia, France, Egypt, the UAE, Qatar, to a lesser extent the United States, Turkey, have all played into the politics of Libya and sustained this atmosphere of lack of central authority and state weakness in Libya. Yemen, of course, sees a regime change with the overthrow of the Ali Abdullah Saleh government and the offensive of the Houthis to take Sana'a and to exercise control over large swaths of the northern and western parts of the country, but unable to extend its authority into the southern and eastern parts of the country. And so you see the Houthis being non-state actors and many other non-state actors, basically determining the state of play in Yemen. Syria, of course, a civil war in which all sorts of regional powers and international powers intervened. The Turks supporting a number of Islamist groups, the Kuwaitis and the Saudis supporting other Islamist groups against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The Iranians sending Iraqi and Afghan militias and Hezbollah into Syria to fight for the Assad regime. And of course, Russia intervening militarily to try to support the Assad regime. All right, so you add to the weakening of Iraq and the persistent weakness of Lebanon, you add you add Libya, you add Syria, you add Yemen, and you have a region-wide crisis, basically. I think Palestine fits into this model, right? The moves in the 1990s toward Palestinian self self-determination, which never culminated in a final agreement, but the peace process that led to the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1993, 94, eventually fell apart in 2006, 2007 with after the Palestinian elections, in which Hamas won a majority of the parliamentary seats and claimed the right to form the government. This put Hamas on a direct policy of confrontation with the Palestinian Authority and the remnants of the PLO. And in 2007, this erupted into open conflict, in which Hamas consolidated its control of the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinian Authority maintained control in the West Bank. And so Palestine itself, not a state, but a territory that was somewhere in a limbo between directly occupied by the Israelis and independent, also became a playing field in which local powers like Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Israel, Qatar, all backed either the Palestinian Authority or Hamas in playing out their own local rivalries and in helping to cement the division between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Now, the consequences of this weakening of central authority, of this splitting open of these polities, is that it's extremely easy for outsiders to intervene. They don't have to fight their way into the politics of these broken states. The local players, whether it be in Libya or Syria or Palestine or Yemen or Iraq, right, or Lebanon, these local players are inviting the outsiders to come into their politics, because these local players need the support of the outsiders. They need their money. They need their guns. They need their diplomatic support on the regional and international levels. And so it's extremely easy in these broken polities for outsiders to establish relations of proxy and alliance with local non-state actors or with what passes for the internationally recognized governments in these places, many of which have just devolved into being one militia among many. It's hard to argue that the Assad regime in Syria is anything but one more militia in the Syrian civil war, right? It's certainly hard to argue that the Palestinian Authority is anything but a militia in a Palestinian civil war that also involves Israel. And you have the power of non-state actors grow as they develop territorial control, as they develop their own sources of revenue, both internally and externally from their patrons on the outside. So I think that what we have to recall here is that the outsiders who get involved in these conflicts, for the most part, are invited in by the local players. Right? Iran has been the best positioned of these regional powers to take advantage of these broken polities. In a good number of these polities, be it in Lebanon or Yemen or Iraq, Shia communities are very prominent. In Iraq, a majority of the population being Shia. In Lebanon, the largest sectarian group are the Shia. The Zaydi Shia, of course, are an extremely important part of the demography of Yemen, probably a third to 40% of the population. And the Alawi regime, which, we can argue whether Alawis are Shia or not. Theologically, I think if you lined up 100 religious scholars, Muslim religious scholars, Shia Muslim religious scholars, and you asked them, are the Alawis Shia? I'd say 90 of them would say no, right? But sociologically, there's this connection. right, between the Alawi regime of the Assads and the Iranians. It dates back to really the early 1980s, right after the Iranian Revolution. And so the Iranians were well positioned to establish these proxy and client relations with Shia communities in these broken states. You'll notice that Libya is not one of the places where Iran has been able to find a foothold. It could be that it's just far enough afield that the Iranians aren't interested, but there's no natural Shia community that would look to Iran for support, that would invite the Iranians in, okay? Now, Palestine is an exception here, obviously, because there's no significant Shia presence in the Palestinian community. It's overwhelmingly Sunni with a Christian minority. But as more and more Arab states make peace with Israel, from Egypt in 1979 through Jordan in 1995, through the Abraham Accords that the Trump administration negotiated in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, Iran becomes the only major regional power that is supporting resistance against Israel, right? And thus, Hamas looks to Iran for support, right? Because it's the only regional power that's willing to support groups that will not join the American-sponsored peace process between Israel, Palestinians, and Arab neighbors. So Iran basically built a model with Hezbollah that it has been successfully able to export into Iraq, into Syria. They're building a militia in Syria in support of the Assad regime, but on the model of Hezbollah, right? And with the Houthis in Yemen. I've always said the Houthis want to be Iran's clients more than Iran wants to be their patron. The Houthis, the Houthi family that leads the Ansar Allah party that we in the West and the outsiders call the Houthis. The leaders of that family were educated in Iran, but they're not 12er Shia like the Iranians are. They're Zaydi Shia. It's a sectarian difference within Shiism. But when they started their movement, right, back in the early 2000s in Yemen, at their rallies, they would chant death to America and death to Israel. Now, most Yemenis don't have any particular engagement with America or Israel. Right? They're far from Israel and very far from America. And Israel and the United States weren't particularly involved in Yemeni politics at that time. Where did they learn this? They learned it in Tehran. And this was an attempt to get the Iranians to notice them. And it was a very successful one, as the Iranians basically adopted the Houthis as a very cost-effective way to make life miserable for Saudi Arabia. Now, other parties in the Middle East attempted to take advantage of these situations to extend their influence as well. Turkey, very notably, sponsored and supported Muslim Brotherhood groups, right? In the democratic opening after the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011, right? The Turkish government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Justice and Development Party, AKP in Turkey, put itself forward as a model for the Muslim Brotherhood groups. I mean, AKP is kind of a Muslim Brotherhood-like political party, Sunni Islamist, bottom up, right? Comes to power through free elections and sustains itself in power for a long time, right? Erdogan basically was supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood electoral efforts in Egypt and in Tunisia with the Nahda party. And Turkey became the first government to call for the overthrow of the Assad regime in Syria, and openly supported the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood in this effort. The problem for the Turks is that the Muslim Brotherhood didn't do so well. It did well in elections in these places, but it didn't do well in the subsequent politics of guns and the use of force. Right? The Assad regime was able to battle its opponents in the civil war and defeat them, or be on the verge now of almost completely defeating them. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, comes to power through free elections in Egypt, but the army overthrows the elected government, and there's not much anybody can do about it. And so the Turkish and the Al Nahda party, which was one of the major parties in the first Tunisian elected government after the fall of the Ben Ali regime, they also lose power. And the Tunisian government now is basically an effort to put the old guard back into power. At least that's the way I would interpret it. Okay, so Turkey made a play and failed. Saudi Arabia, one would assume, has lots of money and regional ambitions. But the problem for the Saudis is that their natural ideological allies were the Salafi jihadists. And the Salafi jihadists, the Al-Qaeda group and then the subsequent Islamic State group, they hate the Saudis and wanted to kill them. And so this is not a particularly friendly proxy group for the Saudis to support. And with by 2015, with the new regime coming into power in Saudi Arabia, a new king and the new crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudis basically move away from this central emphasis of Salafi Islam within their own domestic politics, which is a very interesting story that we don't have time to tell right now. Okay, so it's not like the Iranians didn't have challengers in this effort to spread their influence. They just did it better. They just did it better. And they are, I think, the regional power that has extended its influence the furthest. You know, in their more ambitious moments, Iranians will say, we control 4 Arab capitals, right? Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sana'a. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but there's some truth to it. Okay. So in the current crisis, right, that erupted in the region on October 7th, 2023, and continues to today and has spread to Lebanon, we see, I think, an excellent case study of this phenomenon of the new Arab Cold War, but played out more directly militarily than before. Obviously, Iran has been supportive of Hamas and Hezbollah. When Hamas attacked Israel on the 7th of October, Hezbollah joined the fight in a measured and more symbolic way, but they joined the fight through shelling across the border, the Israeli-Lebanese border. And the Israelis, who are not equipped to play the kind of game that Iran successfully played, right? They're not equipped to develop local allies and proxies. They tried to do this in Lebanon during their occupation of Lebanon after their invasion in 1982 and failed utterly, right? What the Israelis have is not a political project that other groups in the region might be attracted to, the way the Iranians have for Shia communities and other communities like Hamas and the Sunni world. What the Israelis have is military power, right? They are the most powerful military actor of the regional states. Right? Really only Turkey, I think, could match them in terms of military power. And the Turks don't have enough ambition to commit large military forces into the Middle East. They've done it along the Syrian-Turkish border for reasons we can get into in questions if you're interested in that. But the Israelis have the dominant military among the regional powers. So I think it's important for us to note that Israel can get its way militarily against non-state actors. It can defeat Hamas militarily. It can deal Hezbollah enormous blows, as we've seen in this last month. It can even reach within Iran to exercise violence, killing Iranian scientists in Iran who are central to the nuclear program in Iran, killing Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas outside of Gaza, killing him in Tehran while he was in Tehran for the inauguration of the new Iranian president. These are remarkable technical achievements in terms of bringing violence to your enemies. And of course, we all know what the Israelis have done in Gaza, the enormously disproportionate amount of violence that they were able to bring against not only Hamas, but against the civilian population and infrastructure of Gaza, right? But what the Israelis don't have is a political plan for what happens next, right? Like it or not, Hezbollah has a political plan for Lebanon. Like it or not, the Houthis have a political plan and enough domestic support to possibly pull it off in Yemen. Iraqi-supported Shia groups in Iraq have a political plan for Iraq and enough domestic political support maybe to be able to pull that off. The Israelis don't have local allies, and they have no political platform that they can export. Right? Look at Gaza. They're even unwilling to allow the Palestinian Authority, which has been a security partner for Israel since the 1990s. Maybe not the most cooperative one, and at times a difficult one, but a security partner for Israel since the 1990s. They won't let the Palestinian Authority try to reestablish themselves in Gaza. So what the Israelis can do is they can knock a lot of stuff down, but they can't build a lot of stuff up, right? Both physically and metaphorically, politically, right? I always said during the failures of the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, America is really good at destroying states, but not very good at building states. And I think that this is the problem the Israelis face, both in Gaza and in Lebanon. They're able to destroy things, but they're not able to build things. Okay. I don't want to take up too much time. Should I stop here? I can make a few more comments about the United States and all of this, but perhaps you tell me, should I spend 10 more minutes on that, or should we just open it up for questions?
I think we would all love to hear more from you.
Okay. All right. Well, a few more minutes on the US, and then we'll have questions. So there was a persistent notion after the end of the Cold War and the American victory in the Gulf War of 1990-91, which really was, I think, the punctuation mark, the period at the end of the sentence that was the Cold War, right? Because here the United States went to war against a Soviet treaty ally. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union. And in its last, well, we didn't know it was its last months, but in its last months, the Soviet Union, in effect, cooperated with the United States as the United States waged a war against one of its allies. If you didn't think the Cold War had ended in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, that would be enough to convince you that the Cold War had ended. Okay. The United States had this unparalleled role of the position of power at the global level and in the Middle East itself, right? Having fought this very successful war in 1990-91. A lot of people looked at the United States as a hegemonic power. I think that was a mistake. I think it's better to think of the United States as a unipolar power in the Middle East. I don't think it was hegemonic because even though it overwhelmingly had the military and economic power the dominant position in those fields in the region of the Middle East. What it didn't have was the kind of widespread support for the political project that the United States was trying to achieve in the Middle East, right? There are always parties that were not going to accept an American run Middle East in which, right, the Arab states and the other Muslim states, Turkey and Iran, would be at peace with Israel, that they would basically adopt at least the trappings of liberal democratic systems, unless they were monarchies. They would adopt at least the trappings of the liberal democratic system. They would join with the United States in various American global efforts, right? Unlike, say, Eastern Europe or Latin America in the 80s and 90s, where there was an enormous amount of local support for becoming part of the American project, for becoming part of the, if you will, the international, the liberal international order, right? In the Middle East, there were always important actors who rejected that and who put forward an alternative vision of regional politics, and that is the vision that says Islam is the solution, right? Whether it be the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and its proxies and allies in the region, whether it be Muslim Brotherhood groups, or whether it be the Salafi jihadists of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, right, who were players in the politics of the region. Remember, ISIS, for a brief period of time, controlled territory in eastern Syria and northern Iraq that was, you know, as big as the state of Syria, practically, much bigger than the state of Lebanon and the state of Israel and the Palestinian territories in Kuwait and some of these other smaller Gulf states like Bahrain. The United States never had a hegemonic ideological position in the Middle East. There was a famous article that was written by Francis Fukuyama at the end of the Cold War called The End of History. And it helped to define, I think, the way a lot of Americans thought about what the post-Cold War world looked like. And Fukuyama's thesis, and I'm sure many of you know this, and I'm boring you, but that's okay. I'll just bore you for a few minutes. Fukuyama's thesis was that liberal democracy and capitalism had become the unchallenged ideological platform in the world. There was no right-wing challenge to it from, if you will, the fascist tradition of Italy and Nazi Germany and Franco Spain. There was no leftist communist challenge to it, and because of that, this was a Hegelian end of history. And the United States would be kind of the dominant ideological as well as military and economic player. And I always thought that was a really interesting argument, but that it didn't fit the Middle East because there were always these parties in the Middle East that were willing to stand up and say, no, there is an alternative. There is an alternative to democratic capitalism, liberal democratic capitalism, and that is Islam. Okay. So the United States goes into Iraq. It's very rare for a hegemon to try to, in effect, destroy the status quo of an area where it's supposedly hegemonic. But as a result of 9/11, the United States said, we have got to change the status quo in this part of the world, right? That yielded up 19 people willing to fly airplanes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And so the Bush 43 administration, George W. Bush, to be distinguished from his father, George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, after whom my school is named. So I always tell people in the Middle East, I work for the good Bush, not the other Bush. The United States went in in a very deliberate effort, as I said, to change the status quo, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the naive belief that it would be easy to implant liberal democratic capitalist states in these areas. Well, we know how all that turned out. And we know that the Americans were challenged in this notion that they could remake the Middle East, not only by Iran, but by Iran's proxies in Iraq, by Syria, by ISIS, by Al-Qaeda, and to some extent, and interestingly enough, by Israel. Because this American plan for the region also included an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict, which would mean some kind of self-determination for the Palestinians. Right? And that was something that the Bush 41 administration pushed at the Madrid conference of 1991. It was something that the Clinton administration pushed and negotiated right up until the end of its term in 2000, coming the closest that we've ever had to an Israeli-Palestinian agreement and an Israeli-Syrian peace treaty. We're very close on Israel and Syria. But the Clinton administration, I think, to its eternal discredit, was unable to bring those negotiations to successful completion. That is what the Bush 43 administration talked about. They talked about Palestinian self-determination. It's what the Obama administration talked about, and even the Trump administration, the most pro-Israeli of any of the recent American administrations, felt that it had to try to put forward some kind of plan on the Palestinian question. Israeli governments, have successfully resisted that pressure. Now, how they've resisted it is, a story of American domestic politics to a great extent. But as the United States was pushing this notion of a liberal international order, which would mean self-determination for Palestinians, and democratic and human rights models for domestic politics in countries, the Israelis were moving further away from a liberal democratic system, right, with an emphasis on religious identity, right, the religious parties playing a much greater role, the Israeli right increasingly openly rejecting the idea of self-determination for Palestinians. And the Israelis did not pay any price for that. They didn't pay any price for, in essence, rejecting, accepting American military aid, and to some extent, accepting the model of a liberal international economy. Israel becomes, very integrated into world trade, very successful high-tech economy, but they don't buy into the liberal political ideas. They become more and more illiberal. So I think Israel is also a really interesting case of the failure of American, if you will, the hegemonic effort in the Middle East, right? Now, final thing, the US is still a dominant military power in the Middle East. All this talk about the Americans leaving the region was never convincing to me, and it's not borne out by the facts. You can understand why people in the region might think the United States is thinking about leaving, because Barack Obama was elected on a platform of de-emphasizing the Middle East. Donald Trump was elected on a platform of de-emphasizing the Middle East, and Joe Biden was elected on a platform of de-emphasizing the Middle East. But did any of them do it? No. Really? Only Biden took a practical measure to reduce the American footprint in the Middle East with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was accomplished in a haphazard and disastrous way, but which I think was good policy. Right? How long do you want to stay in Afghanistan not getting any results? So in each of these cases, presidents were drawn back into the Middle East. And you see this at the end of the Biden administration, right? I mean, the Biden administration is the leader in diplomacy on Gaza, not that it's had any success, but it is the driver of diplomacy. The Biden administration is conducting military campaign against the Houthis in Yemen in an effort to maintain the shipping lanes in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. The Biden administration was in the midst of negotiating a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. And the Biden administration maintained small troop presences in Iraq and Syria and the very, very large American military infrastructure in the Persian Gulf, right? The United States has military bases in Kuwait, a naval base in Bahrain, a huge Air Force base in Qatar, access to military facilities, both naval and air in the UAE and in Oman. None of that infrastructure changed. So the United States isn't going anywhere. The United States is committed to the Middle East, right? And so the United States will be involved in whatever the post-Gaza, post-Lebanon Middle East looks like. But I fear that the United States will not be in a position to try to bring about any improvement, any kind of real peace, because the American political system is such that presidents are not willing to put pressure on Israel to accept, if you will, the rules of the liberal international order, and important Islamist groups, be it the Islamic Republic of Iran or its proxies with Hamas and Lebanon, are also unwilling to accept, those basic guidelines that the United States would implement if it could. So with that, why don't we open it up for questions?
Amazing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was quite a lecture. I mean, we are impressed that you unfold the whole geopolitical and ideological politics in the Middle East, and you connect with today's developments. And this is something that we have missed a lot in analyzing the developments now in Gaza, in Lebanon, and elsewhere, that we do not connect them with what has happened, with all the trajectory of the events and development before. And of course, we are not connecting them with what happens in the Middle East in the 2000s and beyond. Now, I would like to let's say exploit my my position as not as the coordinator, because the coordinators are Zakia and Stavros, but just as the oldest of the company. You said something about you very well noted that this ideological political project of Iran, which is the strongest of the political projects in the Middle East for the time being, and the absence of political project of Israel and of the United States. This leads me to the conclusion, not the conclusion, but to the prediction, perhaps a very risky prediction, that Israel would like to have a tremendous blow on Iran in order to destroy this political project, the model of the political project. So today's Israel has every interest in having a severe blow, in succeeding in a severe blow on the military blow, because this is the strength of Israel, as you very well said, military blow on Iran. And that means that all this that we are hearing about the symbolic and measured attack or blow will be out of question. Because if it's the only way to destroy the model is to degrade the model as a winning model, let's say, in the region, and also to deprive this model from various resources, oil, perhaps, nuclear facilities, or other. So I think that this is my thinking of what you said about the current developments. And also, do you think that there's any possibility of let's say having new developments within the states that we don't have right now, like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, but particularly Jordan, which is more volatile and has more volatile politics. What do you think about it? About and then we might have actors that would like to enter this Jordan and Saudi Arabia, also in Bahrain. Whether you feel that we might have development from below.
Mhm. Sure. I mean, I think that there's certainly a feeling in Israel, whether justified or not, that they're on a winning streak, that they've been able to seriously degrade Hamas, they've been able to seriously degrade the leadership of Hezbollah, right, through their military and intelligence campaigns, and that Iran is weak as a result, and maybe this is the time to push for a big strike. And there are people in the United States that make this same argument. The Biden administration clearly is urging the Israelis and pressuring them not to do that, because I think that, partially it's just the election coming up, and a huge international blow-up would be no help to the Democrats. Also, I think it's because the Biden administration, I think correctly, fears that an Iranian, if the Israelis have a big strike on Iran, oil facilities, nuclear facilities, that the Iranians would be very tempted to strike not back at Israel, but at American interests on the Arab side of the Persian Gulf. These American military bases that I mentioned, which are very vulnerable to missile attack. And if the Iranian oil facilities are hit by Israel, to hit, Saudi, Kuwaiti, Emirati oil facilities in response. Now, obviously, the Saudis have been trying to improve relations with Iran, I think, in order to prevent that kind of Iranian response. But we know the Iranians hit the Saudis in 2019, hit Saudi oil facilities in 2019. And so it's not unprecedented. Here's a case where I think that at least while the Biden administration is in power in Washington, they might be able to restrain the Israelis in terms of the extent of their military response to the last Iranian missile attack on Israel. But I think you're absolutely right that given their own free choice, the Netanyahu government would have a massive response against Iran. And if the Trump administration comes to power, I think it's more likely that the Israelis would be able at some point to do that, perhaps with American cooperation. A Trump administration would be pulled in two different directions, at least two. First off, we know that Trump is not particularly enthusiastic about American military involvement in the Middle East. In fact, he didn't respond at all in 2019 when the Iranians hit the Saudi oil facilities, which I found remarkable and also troubling. But on the other hand, Trump has always talked very strongly against Iran, and he had a maximum pressure policy against Iran. So you kind of don't know where Trump would sit. But we certainly know that a lot of the people who would come into a Trump administration would be very supportive of a major Israeli strike on Iran. So I think a lot of this might depend on what happens in the United States in the next month and who's going to be the next president. new developments in Saudi and Jordan. I actually think that the Saudis and the Jordanians are in relatively good shape in terms of their domestic political situations. Jordan always has problems domestically. It's a relatively poor country, doesn't have oil revenues. But the Jordanians have been helped to some extent by the fact that when people in Jordan look around and they see Lebanon, they see Syria, they see Iraq, they see what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, they say, we might not like our government, but we don't want to break this government because we see what happens. We see what happens when there's major weakening of central authority. And the combination of that with, still a relatively efficient, if how should I put it, more polite than its neighbor's secret police operation in Jordan, probably keep it together. Saudi Arabia, of course, has oil money, and that has helped it. It helped it during the Arab Spring. Saudi Arabia was the only major Arab state not to experience major demonstrations during the Arab Spring. And to some extent, it was because the Saudis spent $130 billion on their population at that time, gave everybody a raise, threw a lot of money at civil society organizations, well, civil society, at like sporting clubs and cultural groups, and all state control, but they threw a lot of money. They just threw a lot of money into the system. They promised to build, hundreds of thousands of new housing units because there was, a long line for housing in Saudi Arabia. So, yeah, I think that the Saudis, despite the regional instability and despite the fact that the crown prince has sidelined the religious establishment, which had always been a key part of the Saudi elite, the Saudis look pretty stable to me right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'll go for the next two questions. Just giving you heads up, there are quite a few questions on the chat. But as Mr. Russo says, we're going to exploit our position here and start with our own. Two questions. First of all, if within the realm of the new Cold War, right, the Abraham Accords was an attempt to consolidate this new alliance, right? To what extent do you think this alliance has any gravity after the events of October 7th? Do you think eventually Saudi Arabia has no choice but to enter this alliance or this group, even if it's in a couple of years, only because it has to align itself with all this actors. But do you think it has the same gravity? And my second question is, how do you assess Iran's performance since October 7th, but within the realm of the Cold War? Like, do we see it losing? You referred to the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah, but it's very little action, but not necessarily guns-wise, but also, in terms of how they perform during this Cold War. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Great. The Abraham Accords, obviously, I think that the Abraham Accords followed the model of every Arab agreement with Israel, in that I think that much like Sadat's peace treaty with Israel, much like the Jordanian peace treaty with Israel, these were really agreements with the United States to keep these countries, or in the case of Sadat, to move his country into the American system, if you will, at a global level. And the Abraham Accords were very blatantly that, right? The United States promised each of the signatories of the Abraham Accords very specific things in exchange for recognizing Israel, right? Sudan off the terrorist list. Morocco, American recognition of the Moroccan annexation of the Western Sahara. The UAE was promised F-35 jets, although they haven't gotten them yet. And Bahrain was promised an elevated level of defense cooperation. And so I think it was pretty obvious that what the Abraham Accords were deals with the United States in which the U.S. price is recognition of Israel. So I don't think that this is a very solid basis for some kind of regional grouping. Really, only the Emiratis have developed anything like an economic and security relationship with Israel. But it's interesting to note that none of the Abraham Accord countries, nor Egypt, nor Jordan, have broken diplomatic relations with Israel as a result of Gaza. They have withdrawn ambassadors, they have issued condemnations, but they haven't broken diplomatic relations. And so I think that you're right that Saudi Arabia has a number of economic reasons and security reasons to have relations with Israel. However, and I think if October 7th hadn't happened, we might be there already. But it's interesting, since October 7th, the Saudis have very, very publicly raised the price of recognition of Israel. They have very publicly, and the Crown Prince himself very publicly said that it's necessary for there to be a clear timetable toward an independent Palestinian state in order for Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel. Now, he could go back on that in 2 years if, and without paying much cost, right? I mean, public opinion is a factor in Saudi foreign policy, but it's not a huge factor. And so that could happen, but I just think it's interesting that October the 7th and the Israeli response has upped the price for the Saudis of recognition of Israel. Iran's performance. Iran has been, I think October 7th helped the Iranians in that it refocused regional attentions on the Palestinian issue. And Iran, of course, is the only major regional power that is actively asserting resistance against Israel, that it isn't, in the midst of negotiating some kind of recognition of Israel. But the enormous damage that was done to Hamas, and then I think more importantly, the damage done to Hezbollah has shown that Iran is not able to protect its allies the way perhaps people had thought before. Hezbollah here is key because it was the first and in many ways the most important of the Iranian proxies. I mean, it was created by Iran, unlike Hamas, unlike the Houthis, right? It was really created by Iran and had been Iran's most effective instrument in many ways. I mean, they were the dominant power in the Lebanese government. They assisted Assad in staying in power in the civil war. They train the Houthis, right? The Iranians don't speak Arabic. They send the Hezbollah guys down to train the Houthis. And so in that sense, the fact that the Israelis were able to deal such a harsh blow on Hezbollah, killing its leader, decimating its leadership cadre through the penetration of the organization itself to hand out these booby-trapped pagers. That shows Iran to be weaker than I think most people thought. And the fact that the Iranians have launched 2 missile strikes on Israel without doing major damage. And the Israelis were able to bomb an air defense site right next to the nuclear facility in Natanz, and as I mentioned during the talk, to kill Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran itself, I think demonstrated that the Iranians are not as powerful as perhaps some people thought. Now, that doesn't mean that the Iranians don't still have a lot of assets, but I don't think that they're perceived as being as powerful. And it will be interesting to see if this leads to some reassessment within Iran itself of their regional ambitions, right? The new president, much like Rouhani, much like Rafsanjani, has put out the signals that, hey, we want to have a more normal relationship with the West. We want to have a more normal relationship within the region, less revolutionary, if you will. Obviously, there are other parties in Tehran that disagree with that. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, people around the supreme leader, but the fact that Iran is paying such a significant price for its ambitions in extending its power through its proxies. Iran is now paying a price for that. Maybe could lead to some reassessment in Tehran. I wouldn't want to predict that, but it's a possibility.
Thank you. Stavros, would you like to ask something? Thank you so much.
Of course, I have many questions, but I'll limit myself to just one. As a follow-up maybe to Zakia's question, what I wanted to ask was, do you see any correlation perhaps between the push from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates towards the Eastern Mediterranean and the North Maghreb and the Maghreb, North Africa? Is there a split in a silent consensus on look, Iran is gonna deal with the Levant, and we as the Gulf, we're gonna focus on the Maghreb and the Eastern Mediterranean side of things?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, the Maghreb is far away from both Iran and the Gulf states. And I think that for both of them, their security field, their security framework, really doesn't extend to the Maghreb in terms of real commitment of resources. You can see the Iranians not being involved in Libya, but you also, I mean, the Saudis aren't particularly involved in Libya either. It's the Egyptians and then, the Emiratis and the Qataris who have more money than they know what to do with, right? But the Saudis aren't really that involved in Libya, interestingly enough. The Turks are there, the Russians are there, the French, other players, but not so much the Saudis. Now, I don't think that there's a tacit agreement to, Mashriq versus Maghreb in terms of spheres of influence. I think that the Saudis would be more than willing to re-engage with Iraq if they thought that the Iranian position was weakening. I think they'd be more than willing. I think all the Gulf states have indicated they'd be more than willing to patch up their differences with Bashar al-Assad if he's willing to take some distance from the Iranians. So I think we're still in an atmosphere where the Gulf states see Iran as their major security threat, despite the outreach to Iran in recent years. I think they still see Iran as their major security threat, and they'll engage in the Mashriq in an effort to limit Iranian power.
Thank you very much. Zakia, and we're going to start taking questions from the chat.
Exactly. I'm going to start with the question of Kostadina Economou. She's asking, given the escalating tensions between Israel and Iran and the diffusion of conflict into Lebanon, the Palestinian question stands more imperative than ever. As a critical axis, the pursuit of the regional stability. Considering the varied agendas and alliances of the Middle East actors, both states and non-states, how is the future of Palestine and the realization of the Palestinian right to self-determination perceived across the region and the U.S.? And then a second question, it's Agiliki Koletu. Do you think that the U.S. stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is interconnected with the upcoming U.S. elections?
Well, the second one is easy. The answer is yes. Look, American politics is shifting on the Palestinian question, right? This is the first time that we've ever seen any kind of significant mobilization of support in the United States for the Palestinians. But we have to recognize that that support is limited, right? It was college campuses, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. The more important political shift that has occurred over the last 30 years is the fact that the Republican Party, which previously had been considered not as friendly toward Israel, has become very, very supportive not only of Israel, but of the right-wing agenda in Israel. And that has been a really serious change in American politics. Before, it was the Democrats were pro-Israeli and the Republicans were more willing to question the Israelis. Now, the Democratic Party is split between a more progressive wing that takes the Palestinian issue more seriously and, if you will, an old guard wing, of which Joe Biden is, a serious member, that is still very supportive of Israel. Look, the Biden administration is not going to push the Israelis too hard before November the 5th. They just aren't. After November the 5th, it'll be interesting to see. Certainly, there are many people in the administration that think that Netanyahu has been playing them, right? Has been taking advantage of them. But Joe Biden remains a very pro-Israeli president. Those are his instincts. So that's a Palestinian question in the U.S. In the region, right, I think that we see an interesting dichotomy between Iran and the Arab states. In Iran, there's not much public antipathy toward Israel, right? The Iranian population doesn't have that long history of engagement in Arab-Israeli issues, right? They're not Arabs. I always tell my students that I think for the typical Iranian, if you told him, hey, there's an Arab and a Jew fighting, there's a 50% chance that the Iranian would say, oh, I hope the Jew wins, right? There's not that kind of emotional commitment on the Arab-Israeli issue in Iran. But the government, for ideological reasons, is very anti-Israeli, very pro-Palestinian. Islam is Palestinian, the Hamas agenda, no negotiations, no two-state solution. In the Arab world, it's the opposite. I don't think that the salience and the emotional depth of the commitment to the Palestinian cause is the same as it was back in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. But every public opinion poll you see in the Arab world indicates that there is substantial public sympathy for the Palestinian cause, substantial Palestinian sympathy, even as over time there's been more of a reluctant acceptance of the fact that Israel is here to stay, right? That the issue is no longer kind of the restoration of all of Palestine to the Palestinians and the end of an Israeli state. The issue now is some kind of Palestinian self-determination in the West Bank and Gaza. But that is something that has widespread political support in the Arab public opinion, even if the depth of feeling about it might not be as intense as it was. Whereas the Arab governments have been very, very clear that they're ready to deal with Israel, right? Let's not forget that it was only 25 years ago that the Syrian regime of Hafez al-Assad was on the brink of signing a peace treaty with Israel. And Yasser Arafat was shaking hands with Yitzhak Rabin on the White House lawn. So it's Arab leaders, I think, are, they've crossed whatever ideological threshold that had to be crossed to deal with Israel.
Thank you. I'm going to move forward next to the next two questions. They are from two CEMMIS researchers, Alexandros Nikopoulou and Haretini Petrodaskalaki. The first question is, how do you think power dynamics will look like across the Middle East after the end of the Gaza war and the next day of the Israeli-Iranian escalation? Will there be a reshuffling in the pro-Iranian axis? And what will be the position of the Gulf states to this new phase for the region? And the second question is related to Iraq. The destabilization of Iraq, a relative strong state despite its issues, has created a vacuum in the area that continuously creates more destabilization factors in the region. Is there a possibility of a stable Middle East with a weak Iraqi state?
That's a great question. I'll take that second. I'll do the after the Gaza war question. I unfortunately think that that not much is going to change in the region as a result of the Gaza war, aside from the the enormous amount of death and destruction that has accompanied it. I take the point that Iranian proxies have been weakened, but I don't think that they've been eliminated. As I said, Israel doesn't have a political project that would take advantage of this weakening of Iran's proxies to substitute some other indigenous political project that has some support, right? They tried that in Lebanon in 82, 83 and failed. And they really haven't made that kind of effort. In fact, the obvious one of the Palestinian Authority returning to Gaza, they're opposed to. And so I don't see that the Gaza war is going to lead to more stable and if you will, pro-peace governments in either Gaza or in Lebanon. I think these will remain relatively weak states. I think the Iranians will probably regain their footing and be able to rebuild their proxy relations. Their proxy relations in Syria and Iraq and Yemen are not hurt by this war. In fact, they might be helped by it. The wild card here, the caveat I would make to this analysis is, does the costs visited on Iran and its proxies and the evidence that Iranian military power is not particularly effective against Israel, does that lead to some rethinking in Tehran of its regional foreign policy? We'll see about that. We'll see about that. My guess is no. I think that the regime, particularly the supreme leader and people around the supreme leader, and institutionally in the Revolutionary Guard Corps, are ideologically committed to the spread of Iranian power and the ideological project that their proxies, at least theoretically, sign on to. And I think they're also committed to the idea that the United States is an implacable enemy that they cannot have a normal relationship with. I think this question about Iraq is fascinating. Can you have a stable Middle East with an unstable Iraq? I think the bottom line on that is no, because Iraq, in a political vacuum, Iraq sucks in involvement and intention from Turkey, from Iran, and in one form or another from Saudi Arabia. And because Iraq is, a major oil producer, geographically central to the region, as long as it is weak, the temptation for involvement in it is overwhelming. And to rebuild a stable Iraqi state is it's not an easy project. It doesn't take months, it takes years. But in order to have a stable Middle East, I think you've got to have a stable Iraq that's not simply a proxy of Iran, that's not simply a proxy of the United States, that's not simply a divided polity that has very little control over its own borders, its own resources, and access to its own society. So yeah, I think that's a long-term issue in the reconstruction of a political order in the Eastern Arab world, in the Middle East.
Thank you. We're almost at the 2-hour mark, so I think it's a good point to to close the lecture. Professor Roussos.
Yes, once again, I would like to uh, thank you warmly for this lecture, and we hope that we can in the future host you in Athens and have you here and hear you from somewhere in the University of the Peloponnese and from CEMMIS, and we are always looking for your works and for your articles. You make us a lot wiser this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I look forward to continuing our dialogue and hopefully sometime in person.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.